Hello, this is Phenomenology. My name is Mark Thorsby, and in this course we'll be taking a look at Martin Heidegger's seminal text, Being in Time. And in particular, we're going to be taking a look at his discussion in Division 1 of Being in Time regarding being in as such. So welcome back everyone here. So as you should know if you've been watching the video series, and for all my students, you who have been watching it, you'll know that Heidegger has begun in the first part, the first division of Being in Time, by looking at Dasein. Dasein is the being for whom being is an issue, and he's begun by looking at Dasein's fundamental existential constitution as a being in the world. Okay, and he took a look at the question of what it means to talk about a world. He took a look at the question of what it means to be a who in the world. And now we're going to see how he approaches the question of, or rather the problematic or the theme of being in as such. What does it mean to be in the world in terms of the inness? And you're going to see he's going to begin by articulating that in terms of the concept of there. That is, to be in is to be there. It's to be somewhere. And so we're going to sort of jump in on that point in Heidegger's text. So welcome back. I hope you guys are doing well. I'm going to sort of run through this. There's a lot to cover in this this chapter section. In this chapter, so I hope you'll bear with me. I'm not going to be able to cover everything that Heidegger discusses. Particularly, I'm going to mainly. One moment. My apologies. We're going to mainly going to be skipping those sections in which Heidegger gives a historical hermeneutic critique. Primarily when he looks at how Aristotle or the Stoics or our earlier philosophers have understood the same concepts. I'm going to sort of gloss over that and try to stick with the fundamental structural elements indicative to his argument. So welcome back. The task. Paragraph 28 here begins with the task of a thematic analysis of being in. So we've talked about being in the world, and we've looked at some of the structural elements that are constitutive of being in the world, first in terms of the world, and second in terms of the who of things. And you'll notice some of the key concepts we've discovered from Heidegger is the idea that when we talk about our being alongside the world, being with others in the world, that is fundamentally organized in terms of a comportment of concern. Being with has been conceptualized in terms of Heidegger's conception of solicitude, and being oneself in terms of the who, and we looked at that in quite a lot of depth in our last video. So that's what we've done up to this point. What we're going to begin with here is the question of being in, and we're going to sort of jump into that full bore. And of course, the first thing we have to ask here is how can we approach this problem? Because being in is not a matter of being inside in the way we might conceive of insideness in the present to hand. So for instance, I have a cup here, and there's liquid inside of it. I mean, we can understand it according to conceptual, physical, mechanical theoretics. But that's not what being in is about. Being in is not a characteristic or an affect. Right? Being in is something that's fundamental and essential for the type of being that Dasein is. As Heidegger says, it is an essential kind of being, and it's a sort of in-between, if you will. On the one hand, you can think of what a subject in the present to hand would be, and what an object in the present to hand. Of course, the classic dichotomy here is the subject-object split. And Heidegger sort of postulates here that we can understand being in as the between of those two polarities. And that, of course, is not going to be sufficient, but it does, if you will, give us a clue for understanding what exactly Heidegger is up to when he talks about our being in somewhere. Now, the key is to understand that for Heidegger, being in is fundamental to Dasein's existential spatiality. And if you need a brush up on that, take a look at our earlier video. I believe it's 2 videos before this one, where we looked at Heidegger's conception of existential spatiality. And remember here is that space is not conceived in terms of 3 dimensions. It's conceived of in terms of Dasein's involvement with the world, and we can talk about regions and this sort of stuff with Heidegger, but it's fundamentally about Dasein's concernful involvement with things. So so given that, and if you keep that register in your mind of of Heidegger's conception of existential spatiality at the ready, because we're going to see that Dawson's being in the world is fundamentally it's there, as it were, right? And when we talk about being a there, there's two different ways in which we can understand this, or rather two different dimensions to the there. On the one hand, to talk about any there, you're talking about a Dawson's here, right? So to talk about a there for Dawson is to refer to a place where Dawson is, as it were the yonder of the ready to hand. And recall here the distinction between the ready to hand and the present to hand. The present to hand concerns Dawson's understanding of something in terms of its essence as given in a sort of presence of being, whereas the ready to hand concerns the way in which we're involved with things in the world, right? The way in which when I use this pen and pick it up and start writing, I'm not in fact going to be I'm not thinking of the pen as an object that's present to consciousness, as a pen, what's essential about a pen. No, I'm just thinking of it as something I can use in terms of my concernful involvement, in terms of the task that I have to accomplish. And so, of course, for Heidegger, that means that we're automatically going to be thinking about directionality, disseverance, that which is disseverant. Remember, disseverance amounts to making the farnish vanish, such that when Dawson, or we, rather, because we are Dawson, when we're involved with the world, we dissever ourselves from the things that we're involved with. So the pen, which can seem remote to me, suddenly becomes closer, right? And think here about, when you think about disseverance, think about, for instance, when you watch something on television or you hear something in the news, right? Something which is far suddenly comes near. That's the phenomenological conception of disseverance. And of course, concernful involvement. And concernful involvement has to do with Dawson's understanding of itself as a being in the world. And we're going to see that, remember, the fundamental sort of realization that Heidegger came to in our last video was that Dawson's concernful involvement with the world almost always falls into the they. It falls into a sort of inauthentic mode in which Dawson absorbs the concern of the public into itself, and this is a problematic thing. We're going to see this actually takes an important part of Heidegger's analysis in today's chapter section of being in the world, or being in as such. Now, remember, Dawson brings its there along with it. That's because of Dawson's concernful involvement. So Dawson is its own disclosedness, as you will, right? So the there for Dawson is not something that's closed off to Dawson. Dawson is fundamentally involved and wrapped up in its there, right? So, and Heidegger says, so what we're going to try to do then is we're going to try to understand the there in terms of this existential constitution. And there's a couple things that he's going to address. For instance, he's going to look at being there in terms of a state of mind, fear as a mode of the state of mind, being there as a form of understanding, or he's going to talk about an equiprimordial characteristic of understanding, and then he's going to talk about interpretation, assertion, and logic, and then ultimately language and discourse itself. And then that's sort of the first sense when he talks about the existential constitution of the there. And then he's going to look at and add in his analysis of the they, and look at the question of the everyday being of the there, and the way in which we actually sort of operate in terms of where we're at. And this is the falling of Dawson, he calls it. And his discussion is going to focus on idle talk, curiosity, ambiguity, and of course, the final synthesis of them all, Dawson's throne projection and Dawson's falling nature. So there's a lot that we're going to be looking at in this chapter. So I'm going to sort of jump to it. And so I think you're going to find it's quite informative. And ultimately, Heidegger is quite provocative. And I think that you're going to leave the video here, or you're going to leave Heidegger's chapter with really a lot of fundamental questions about your own being in the world, right? Your own involvement. And that's one of the marks, I think, of a great philosopher, is someone who can really, I think, shake you up a bit. And I think that this section of Heidegger's Being in Time certainly does that. So let's talk about we're going to start off with his section, the existential constitution of there, and we're going to see that he begins with the discussion of the state of mind and mood. Okay, so quickly, what are some reminders here? Remember, Heidegger is describing how we exist. He's not describing what we're doing when we exist, right? Or he's not, well, he is to a certain degree, but he's not describing the what of existence, but rather the how of existence. So he's describing how we actually exist and how the way in which we exist unfolds over time. And being there is ultimately therefore a question of how we exist. Dasein's there needs to be understood in terms of concernful involvement. We've mentioned that already. So how do we exist in any place whatsoever? Well, the answer is that we have moods and states of mind. Now remember, Heidegger is not here considering the there of a Dasein in terms of the specific spatiality. In terms of, for instance, here I am in my home office. That's not the kind of there that he's describing. He's trying to understand what does it mean to be in the world in terms of just, as it were, submersed into our involvement with things in the world. So we're not talking about locations or places, although of course Dasein has locations and places. So what we are talking about is every time Dasein is in some place, some particular place, Dasein is in a mode of concernful involvement, and what seems to have always come along with that involvement is a certain sort of mood or a certain state of mind. And so, for instance, just consider in your own life, contrast, for instance, the mood or the state of mind you might be in when you're at work versus the mood or state of mind you might be in when you're on the weekend and you have a day off. You'll notice that there is a difference in how you're involved in the world. But now also notice that every time you go anywhere, you always have some sort of state of mind, regardless of where you're at, and sometimes there are bad moods and so on and so forth, right? So, how are we to understand this conception of mood? Well, ontologically, the state of mind can be ontically described as mood or being attuned. Now remember, the ontological difference is the difference between being as such and beings in their particularity as entities, right? So I have being in the sense that I have existence. That's an ontological statement. But I'm also a being, a human being, right? Notice the actual name of our species. I'm a human being, and that concerns my particularity as an entity in the world. Now, ontically, state of mind is a mood. It's the way in which we attune ourselves to things in the world. And here, think about, even though Heidegger doesn't mention it, he certainly has in the back of his mind here the notion of harmonia that comes out of Heraclitus, which is the notion that we harmonize or we attune ourselves to things in the world. And the idea here is that when we talk about the mood or involvement we have in the world, our concernful dealings, that means that Dasein's being in is ultimately a form of being attuned to, right? So mood here is understood existentially, and it refers to something that comes before or is prior to a psychological state. And so when he talks about a mood, he's not talking about a psychological state, but what he would say is that when I have a psychological state, that psychological state presumes a priori that there is an existential state of mind, right? Or a mood. So moods have sort of two different aspects to them, along with potentially others. Heidegger talks about they have an undisturbed equanimity, and they also have an inhibited ill humor, right? That is, which I think is sort of interesting. And what Heidegger is trying to describe by this undisturbed equanimity and our inhibited ill humor is that we're always slipping in and out of moods from one mood to another, right? So these moods are sort of coming and going, but there is a way in which there always is a mood. So the mood is always ever present, if you will, right? So in our moods, what happens though is that it looks like we become satiated with ourselves, right? Being becomes manifest as a burden, right? And here, for instance, think of the state of mind one is in, for instance, in their everyday life. For instance, when they're at the grocery store and they've got a whole bunch of other things they need to do, and they're trying to move through the grocery store quickly, right? The way in which we exist gets manifested as a sort of burden. And it's a burden in relationship to the task or the concernful involvement we have with something in the world, right? So, and in that sense, we become satiated with ourselves because we are a part of that involvement, right? That's his idea. And so a mood makes manifest not only how one is, but also how one is faring in the world, right? You, for instance, imagine, or not imagine, just think in your own life when you've met someone that you like or know or whatnot, and you've noticed that they're in a bad mood, right? What you notice is that their state of mind shows or discloses to you how they're faring in the world, right? It tells you something about what their manner of being in the world is at that particular time, right? So what does this mean? It means that Dasein is always disclosed in its mood. It's disclosed mood-wise, as it were. And it also means that Dasein, for the most part, evades the being, which is disclosed in the mood, right? So Dasein discloses itself in its mood, but remember, when Dasein is in a state of mind, it's actively participating in trying to do something, and in that sense of trying to perform some task, it's evading itself. But in that evasion, it also discloses itself. So you have this sort of double movement that's going on here, a sort of parallax view of Dasein, right? The characteristic of Dasein's evasion shows that Dasein gets veiled in its daily activities and locations, right? So when Dasein's in the world and it has a state of mind that's attuned to its involvement in the world, Dasein gets veiled over, but in that veiling, it's disclosed ever more, right? So that Heidegger says, but Dasein is disclosed in the veiling all the more unveiledly, right? You gotta love Heidegger and love philosophers because they just love to make up these words unveiledly. But it makes sense here. He's trying to describe this sort of double movement that seems to occur. Now, how can we describe this in one word? The answer is thrownness. So this has become a very important part of Heidegger's ontology for Dasein, and that's the idea that Dasein is thrown into the world, and thrownness just refers to the way in which Dasein has a state of mind that's attuned to the world, but yet tells you something about the world in its veiling of itself, right? This is the conception of thrownness. And you're going to see Heidegger is going to elementally construct a conception of thrown projection, which is really quite critical to the whole ontology of what it means to be human ultimately, right? So let's get back to it. Thrownness, Heidegger says in 135, suggests the facticity of its being delivered over, right? So Dasein is delivered over to its involvement in the world, and that's the notion of why he's using the language of to throw, to the thrownness, right? Now, ultimately, thrownness is a term that resonates with the register of facticity, right? Now, facticity is not the factuality of the factum brutum of something present at hand, right? So he's not talking about here the materiality, the substantiality of something as such. Facticity is a characteristic of Dasein's being, right? It's a characteristic of Dasein's being because Dasein, it's one which has been taken up into existence even if proximally has been thrust aside. So on the one hand, Dasein sort of kind of throws itself aside in its involvement with the world, but that facticity that we're talking about is precisely that movement that Dasein makes, that we make, for instance, right? So for the most part, though, Heidegger says, our mood is not one of a burden, right? So most of the time our state of mind, and a mood is a state of mind, because later on Heidegger, when he has said state of mind, he'll put in parentheses mood. So these two, he's using the term mood to get us to a conception, a formalized conception of state of mind. But for the most part, these moods we have, they don't feel like a burden, right? So, for instance, when I'm at the beach and I'm going swimming, right, I'm in a certain state of mind that's attuned to the water and to the swimming, to the activity, but it doesn't feel like a burden. Not like, for instance, maybe the grocery store or a laundry list might feel like to a person. So it's not always a form of state of burden. But it is always by way of a state of mind that this turning away is what it is, right? So the movement where I turn away from myself into the world is this is what the state of mind fundamentally, ultimately always is. It's not always a burden as such, but it is always a turning away from Dasein's own self, right? And this is done factically as a form of Dasein's being. Now, factically, Heidegger argues, quote, Dasein can, should, and must, through knowledge and will, become master of its moods in a certain ways of existence, and this may signify priority of volition and cognition. So that does come from 136. That's a typo there. But what Heidegger is basically saying here is that in order to be involved and to succeed in the world, Dasein has to become a master of its moods. Now, we're never free of our moods, though. We can't get rid of the moods because we're always involved in a mood of some sort. So there is a way in which we can talk about bad moods. Right now, of course, bad mood for him is not the idea that I'm upset and I'm angry. That's a psychological state. A bad mood for him is something that's an inauthentic mood. And that's when I have a state of mind where I have, if you will, an inability in my own state of mind to actually be involved with my concernful dealings with the world, right? So a bad mood is when I have a state of mind, but nothing is working out, as it were, right? He says, quote, the mood has already been disclosed in every case, being in the world as a whole, and makes it possible, first of all, to direct oneself towards something, right? So the mood is always going to be there, even and that's why we have bad moods, right? Because we can't get rid of moods, even when we can't fully succeed in our concern for involvement with the world. Now, existentially, a state of mind implies a disclosive submission to the world, out of which we can encounter something that matters to us, right? So a state of mind reveals both the way in which we are disclosed in a submission to the world, and the way in which we encounter things in the world, and the way in which things matter to us, right? Now, it's important here that we could, if you will, if we wanted to give an existential anthropology or something, we could talk about the different types of states of mind. Heidegger takes a moment to tell us that this is not what he's doing, although it could be something that one does. So Heidegger does not cover the different states of mind, although they exist. That's because he's ultimately interested in this question of being, and Dasein's form of being, and maybe in a different book, and maybe this is something you could follow up in your own essay, right? So feelings and affects are derivative of moods. They're not the moods themselves, right? And Heidegger suggests that, for instance, if you take a look at Aristotle's rhetoric, and you also take a look at the Stoic philosophers, you'll see some important working out of the question of what a state of mind is. But Heidegger doesn't think that since Aristotle really, maybe the Stoics since then, the question of what it means to be in a state of mind has not really been followed through very thoroughly in philosophy. Now, he does think that when we have a state of mind, the state of mind is not something that's present to us as a state of mind, right? So, or it can be, but for the most part it's not. And that means that our state of mind sink to the level of the phenomena, which means that it makes sense why philosophers perhaps have not discussed states of mind, because states of mind become sort of equalized, or they become lowered into the soup of the phenomenal experiences that we're having. That is, I'm experiencing the world with the state of mind, but I'm really just focusing on the experiences I'm having, and it all sort of kind of gets hidden, as it were. So, but a state of mind, regardless, is an existential way, is the most basic existential way in which Dasein is it's there. It's in the being in as such. Now later on, he's going to talk about anxiety as an important, not so much in this section, but later on in Being in Time, he will talk about anxiety in an important sense, especially regarding his analysis of being and death. We're not going to get to that, unfortunately, in our video series here, but I encourage you to take a look at that. It's from Division 2 of Being in Time. Okay, what happens in paragraph 30 is Heidegger takes up, he says, okay, we've got these states of mind, and he sort of takes a moment and says, well, wait a second, fear is also one of these modes of a state of mind. Fear is one of these moods that we have, and there's three different ways we can think about fear, and fear is important because fear as a state of mind helps reveal Dasein in its sort of full disclosure, and you're going to see why here in a moment, right? Well, the first here, the three ways we have to analyze fear, Heidegger argues, is first we have to talk about that in the face of which we fear, the fearsome. We have to talk about what is fearful, what should we fear, what does it mean to fear as such, and then what is it or ultimately afraid? What is it? What is that about which we fear ultimately? And that is ultimately Dasein fears about itself. We'll see that in a moment. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Now, that in the face of which we fear is the fearsome. And Heidegger says, he talks, sort of gives a description, an ontological description of Dasein, and in the way in which Dasein's fear is generated in terms of its encounter and its involvement with things in the world. I remember years ago I was hiking up in Alaska in the middle, right near the Denali National Park, and I was hiking, and I was afraid that there were bears that were going to jump out and eat me. Right, true story. I was nervous about it, and that's because I'm in the world, but what I'm fearing is ultimately a certain type of encounter and a certain form of involvement with the world. The type of encounter that is fearsome, that I fear, is one which is detrimental to me as a being. So Dasein is afraid of that which is detrimental to its being. Detrimentality is always understood in terms of proximity. So there's certain things that Dasein recognizes that are detrimental to it, but if they're not close to Dasein, if they have a far proximity, then Dasein's not concerned. But the closer that proximity gets in terms of Dasein, the more and the greater the potential for the detrimentality to occur, then the more fearsome something becomes, right? So when I'm in Alaska and I'm hiking and I know there's grizzly bears, well, I know that the detrimentality has a closer proximity than it does when I'm in the city, right? And I'm not worried about grizzly bears, and I'm not afraid of grizzly bears there. But when I'm in Alaska, I am afraid of grizzly bears. Think about, for instance, people who say they're afraid of flying. They're not afraid of flying when they're not on a plane. And that's because the proximity of that detrimentality has been pushed back, right? So this is a sort of important thing, and because you can see here is that for Heidegger, if our mood or our state of mind is ultimately based in a form of involvement we have with the world, then fear has to be understood according to that dynamic as well. Now, what is fearing as such? Well, fearing is discovered by way of the fearsome, right? So I don't actually engage in fear unless there is the fearsome itself, right? You can think here about how people who maybe are in a dangerous situation but don't know they're in a dangerous situation don't have fear, right? That's because it's the fearsome, and it's my recognition of the proximity of the fearsome that initiates this state of mind of fearing, right? So fear is a sort of slumbering possibility for being in the world, and it's ultimately a state of mind. Now, there are types and variations of fear, Heidegger argues. For instance, there's dread, there's terror, timidity, shyness, misgiving, becoming startled all of a sudden. These are all different variations of fear that we could talk about. Now, the most important feature of Heidegger's analysis of fear is ultimately the third part, which is that about which we fear. Well, what do we fear? When I'm near the grizzly bear, of course I fear, I'm afraid of, as it were, the grizzly bear, but it's not the grizzly bear as such that I'm afraid of. What I'm afraid of is me. I'm afraid of me being destroyed in some way, right? I'm afraid of myself being killed, right? So that about which we fear is ultimately Dasein. Dasein is the subject of our fear, right? We do not first ascertain a future evil and then fear it, right? That which fears about is that very entity which is afraid, Dasein. So Dasein fears itself to a certain degree, or its loss of itself. Fear, interestingly enough, discloses Dasein, right? Dasein makes itself known as an entity in itself when it's afraid, right? So there are varying degrees of explicitness in fear, obviously. But what fear does universally is that it closes off our endangered being in, right? And so I'm in the world, and I'm there in the world, and I'm involved with the world. But when I'm afraid, suddenly the world closes in, and it's not the world I'm really concerned with anymore or involved with. It is myself that I'm involved with. Dasein's in danger of being in. fear closes off our being in the world. And yet at the same time, it lets us see it. It lets us see what it means to be in the world, because when we're afraid of losing ourselves in the world, that's precisely when the world is most readily available for us to see as something that we're involved in. So Dasein must first find its way about again. So think about a time in which you've been startled or afraid of something. It takes you a moment to sort of reorganize yourself into a state of involvement with the world, right? For instance, years ago, and I'm sure this is, of course, I'm sure is well documented in many, many ways and by many different people. But years ago, there was, I didn't know the person, but there was a clerk at a store, a drugstore, close by where I lived, and she was in high school, and I was in high school actually at the time. And I remember there was a person came, and a robber, and held her up at gunpoint, right? They put a gun up to her head, told her to give her all the money, etc. Well, it took her, because someone else I knew her, it took her weeks, months to be able to get back into a state where she could be involved in the world in the ready to hand, one where Dasein isn't concerned with itself, but is concerned with the world as an object of involvement as such. And so fear dislodges Dasein, and that's why Dasein, it takes a while for Dasein to get sort of back in to a state of the ready to hand, given the explicit degree of fear that one experiences, right? So remember, fear here is not a psychological state. Fear is rather a state of mind that's equiprimordial for Dasein, and it's equiprimordial with understanding, because being there is a form of understanding. Now, Heidegger says states of mind or moods are equiprimordial with understanding, which means that these are both fundamental and a priori for the constitution of our being in the world, but they're also equal with each other. So if you will, states of mind can occur if and only if you also have states of understanding, right? Essentially, they're materially conditional upon each other. That's one logical way of sort of understanding this. Dasein is equiprimordial with the world, and states of mind are equiprimordial with understanding. Now, what is understanding here? Understanding is an existential. That which we have such competence over is not a what, but being as existing. So remember here, when we're talking about understanding, we're talking about the existential. We're talking about the how of Dasein's movement and involvement with being in the world. So we're not talking about a what, right? So for instance, most of the time when someone, if you're taking a college class, like many of you may be, and of course my students are, if you're taking a college class, then understanding often takes the form of a what, right? For instance, in mathematics, if someone is learning about derivatives in calculus, they want to know what a derivative is. This is not the type of understanding that Heidegger is talking about. Understanding here concerns ultimately something that's primordial and equanimous with the state of mind as such. So let's see here. Dasein is primarily a form of being possible. And this is ultimately what understanding is about. When we're thinking about how Dasein exists in the world, Dasein exists in terms of a movement of recognizing its ownmost possibilities in the world. So, for instance, at every point of time a person is living, to understand is to understand how they can exist and be involved in the world. That is, understanding is a possibility recognition, ultimately. It's a way of recognizing and articulating our possibilities. Understanding is about possibility. Now, possibility here for Heidegger is not an empty logical category of the present to hand, right? It's not a vorhanden, right? Because of course you can think a mathematician could say that, could talk about the possible relations of a geometric figure, right? That's an empty logical category. For Dasein, understanding is about the possibility of our involvement with the world. Now, that means possibility is not about pure contingency either. It's not just about things that can just happen as such. Possibility is an existential, possibility as an existential is more primordial and ultimate, is the more primordial and ultimate positive way in which Dasein is characterized ontologically. That is, if we're to understand Dasein in terms of its positive constitution, how it exists and manifests itself in the world, we'd have to say that Dasein manifests itself according to an axis or a series of axes of possibility, right? Dasein's state of mind gets itself into definite possibilities. So, for instance, when I'm in a state of mind, let's say Heidegger gives the example, for instance, about a hammer. Not too long ago, I had a flood here in my house, and so I was downstairs hammering in the baseboards into my wall, into the floor, to put in a new carpet, right? So when I'm hammering and I'm in a state of mind, my state of mind is a mood of construction and a mood of involvement with, getting the job done, as it were. I'm not thinking about philosophy as much as I love philosophy when I'm doing it. I'm thinking about this nail, etc., right? So that means that while I'm doing that, I'm in a state of mind, but I'm also understanding what is possible and what's not possible within the framework or the frame of that state of mind. And that gets me into definite, distinct material possibilities, right? And that means that Dasein exists not only as throne, but as a throne possibility. And you can see he's going to ultimately build up to a conception of projection in just a moment. Now, understanding is the being of such potentiality for being, right? Potentiality for being is just to talk about what I could be, and that means understanding is the form of being that gets me into what I could be, right? That is, for instance, so when I was doing hammering, the possibility that I was aiming for was to be done, because I don't know about you, but I'm not a very good, as you could probably imagine, I'm not a very good construction worker, and I'm not a very good handyman. I don't really know well what I'm doing. And so my whole goal was to get to a potentiality of being which I could stop. I could no longer have that state of mind. And so this is to sort of understand, or that is, understanding is an essential part of our state of mind, because our state of mind is organized towards, or in lieu of, or with an interconnection to understanding. Okay? Now, understanding is not knowledge about things as such, but a knowledge about the possibilities for existing. This is, of course, the difference between thinking of understanding as an existential rather than thinking of understanding as something that's present to hand. Now, it's only because Dasein has understanding that it can be led astray and not understand or to misunderstand, right? It's only because we have this fundamental primordial, equiprimordial constitution of understanding that it's possible for us to misunderstand things, right? Because think about when you have a misunderstanding, that presupposes the existential possibility of understanding, right? Even if it can't actually be actualized as such. So what this means is that understanding is fundamentally Dasein's there. So when I say I'm there in the world, not only is my being in the world, accompanied with the state of mind, a mood, but it's also accompanied with an understanding of myself in the world. Now, it's an understanding about my possibilities for the world, so it's one which maintains the veil of Dasein. So I don't really, when I think of how I understand, when I'm understanding the world existentially, I'm not thinking of myself as such, not usually. But it reveals myself as such. It reveals Dasein, right? So you still have that same I call it a parallax distinction there. I don't know if that's the right term or not. No, understanding is is the existential being of Dasein's own possibility for being, and it is so in such a way that this being discloses in itself what its being is capable of, right? So understanding always presses forward with possibilities, and this is the structure of projection, right? So so Heidegger talks about Dasein in terms of thrown projection. I'm thrown into the world in terms of the facticity of my involvement, but my understanding is a form of projection onto the world, where I understand my own most possibilities within my thrownness of the world, right? You can see it's very difficult here to describe Heidegger's discussion without using the language that he's setting forth here, which is both positive and negative, I suppose, right? But this ultimately is a very important concept for Heidegger, and this is the concept of thrown projection. Now, the character of understanding as projection is constitutive for being in the world, So it's a fundamental constituting feature. It's not just the application of a plan or a theory. So projection isn't the idea that I have an idea and I'm projecting it onto the world, right? Projection is the form of existing that I take on when I'm in the world and I'm involved with the world. Dasein therefore understands itself in terms of its projecting of possibilities. Now, understanding can take two different forms here. It can take on an authentic form and an inauthentic form. Understanding as an authentic form is when I understand when Dasein understands itself in terms of its own possibilities. An inauthentic form of Dasein's understanding occurs when Dasein understands its possibilities in terms of someone else or something else. And here he's going to say the they, right? When I let the crowd determine my possibilities, this is what is inauthentic. Now, this will come sort of much later in section B of Heidegger's analysis, but he's sort of laying the groundwork here and laying the framework for us. Now, that means that understanding also, of course, needs to be understood as an existential modification of projection as a whole. So understanding is quite fundamental. Now, finally here, the last sort of phrase, quote I wanted to throw your way from this section is Heidegger says on 148, by way of having a mood, Dasein sees its possibilities. And so, and Heidegger introduces the conception of sight here in terms of phenomenological sight. Understanding the phenomena always happens according to this fundamental existential constitution of understanding and our states of mind. And so that means that I see the world in terms of these states of mind, both figuratively as well as phenomenally and literally, in fact, right? So for instance, when I look at this and I see it as a cup, it's not a theoretical object that I'm seeing, but rather to see it as a cup is ultimately to understand and to interpret it as something that I'm involved with in the world, and thus I will have a drink here. Okay? So, okay, let's go back here. So to section 32, understanding and interpretation. So Heidegger is going to be building up this conception. We have this basic conception of understanding. Well, what is interpretation? Well, understanding is a form of Dasein's projection, and projection itself has its own possibilities. So how I understand my possibilities in the world also has its own set of possibilities, and that means that these possibilities can be developed over time. And so the development of my understanding is what interpretation is. To interpret something is to develop and to have an ongoing further fulfillment of my understanding, of my involvement with things. Okay, and so what I have here is sort of, I've taken a number of sort of quotes and tidbits from this section that I think are helpful for understanding it, and I'm going to read through those now. Interpretation occurs when, quote, concernful being alongside the ready to hand gives itself to understanding whatever involvement that which encountered can have, right? So it's about the encounter, it's about our involvement in the encounter with things, right? And we see things in terms of our ready-to-hand involvement. So it's interesting here, go back to when I was in Alaska hiking around Denali. And my worry was I was interpreting the different things I was seeing in terms of my involvement of fear, actually, right? And if I did see a moose, for instance, when I saw a moose, I didn't see the moose as just a piece of the animal life that was up there. And I didn't also see it as a cute little creature that the Tourist Bureau of Alaska wants you to think of. I saw the moose as an object of fear, as something dangerous, right? And that's because we see things in terms of our ready-to-hand involvement. And that, of course, is related to our state of mind and our understanding as such. Now, when we end up just staring at something, Heidegger says, this is actually a failure to understand something any further. If you've ever had a moment where you're trying to understand something and you eventually just end up by just staring at something, well, that's exactly when your understanding is failing, right? You no longer have any further understanding, and therefore, of course, you no longer have an interpretation of that thing. Now, interpretation, though, for Heidegger is an existential term, which means he's not talking about the system of attaching significations to entities, right? So interpretation is not a matter of me taking the words cup and applying them to this thing here, right? Interpretation is the way in which I develop possibilities of involvement regarding myself or Dawson's being in the world, right? So you got to always remember, and Heidegger's consistently reminding us to take these within the frame of an existential. And it's really easy to stop doing that and to lapse back in to the present to hand. Now, interpretation is organized by the totality of involvements that are available to Dasein, right? Obviously, there's all these different possibilities, and interpretation comes from out of those. Now, whenever something is interpreted as something, the interpretation will be founded essentially upon a forehaving, upon a foresight or a foreconception. An interpretation is never a presuppositionless apprehending. That is, right, because we're talking about Dasein's involvement with the world, interpretation always begins somewhere, right? There's never that means it always starts off with something you already have or something you already see or a concept that's already articulated and available to you. So that means that interpretation is never objective in the sense that it begins whole cloth with what is seen, right? Interpretation always starts off with what is already understood as Dasein's disclosed involvement toward that thing. So that means that whenever we talk about interpretation, on the one hand, we can talk about a for structure and an as structure. The for structure is what I'm taking previously in terms of my movement of interpretation, in terms of what I'm already familiar with in terms of my involvements. And the as structure concerns how I see something as something, right? To interpret is to see something as something else, right? Or to see something as something in a new way, right? So, and that as structure is related to this for structure. There's not a logical equivalence, but certainly an important equiprimordial relation, using Heidegger's speak here. Okay? So when we talk about meaning, right, to interpret something is to try to understand what something means, right? So meaning is that wherein the intelligibility of something maintains itself, right? Meaning is the maintenance of intelligibility. Something can maintain a certain intelligibleness. Now, that which can be articulated in a disclosure by which we understand is what we call meaning. So, meaning is not only that which maintains itself, but it is that which is articulated. Now, meaning is the upon which of a projection in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something, right? Now, remember, he's throwing in and lacing within his discussion of meaning here the notion of thrown projection. So, intelligibility is about the upon which it's what I'm projecting towards or at, or as it were, right? It gets its structure from a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception. Meaning is an existential of Dasein. It's not a property that gets attached to an entity, right? And this is for Heidegger necessary if you're to understand Dasein existentially, right? Dasein is looking for meaning, and it's finding meaning, and it's projecting meaning in the world, and it does this through this formal structure of interpretation that's equiprimordial with understanding and states of mind. But meaning is not a property. It's not a characteristic. It's not something you can see in the world, right? And notice here that you see the world, but the world isn't meaningful to a person just because they see it, right? Think about how an infant sees the world. There's no meaning there, or there's very minimal meaning for an infant. And that's because it's not a property, right? It's not something that one sees. It's rather related to this forehaving, this foresight, and the way in which that can become stabilized over in time. Now, when we talk about interpretation, Heidegger says there's a sort of circularity involved here, right? On the one hand, the circularity seems to be that I enter in, when I want to understand something, I already have a foresight, and that means that I understand according to that foresight, and there's a sort of way in which something ends up circularly reinforcing itself. Now, on the one hand, you could see this as a vicious problem, and it would be a vicious problem if what you're trying to articulate is an interpretation of the present to hand, right? But he says you can understand this in a virtuous way. Perhaps interpretation is a virtuous circle when we understand interpretation as an existential movement of Dasein, not as something attached to an object or an entity, not some present-to-hand essentialism, but rather understand interpretation as a movement, as an activity of Dasein, and then you begin to see that this circularity isn't a problem whatsoever. In fact, it's virtuous because it shows and it demonstrates and it also kind of reiterates the degree to which Dasein is always already involved in the world, right? And Heidegger gets into an interesting discussion about history and mathematics here, which I don't really want to get into because for sake of time. But for him, history and mathematics, mathematicians and historians are ultimately both doing interpretation in the same way, but the difference is the mathematician has a much narrower scope of interpretation than the historian. And so it's just sort of interesting here. So I wanted to throw that in there. Okay, now the next paragraph 33 here is about assertion and what an assertion is. An assertion is a derivative mode of interpretation. So all interpretation is grounded on understanding, and every assertion gets its meaning. Now, that means that when I understand something and I interpret it, I make a statement about something. I assert something. I make a judgment. Now, there's three significations for the conception of interpretation here. Pardon me. And the three significations are: number one, assertion is a type of pointing something out. It's the way in which we let an entity can be seen from itself. Number two, assertion gives a definite character, right? It's also a predication. And think about the way in which we can talk about subjects and predicates. When I say that the grass is green, I'm predicating greenness to the subject of grass, right? And that means when I make an assertion has a definite character. I'm saying something definite. And number three, an assertion is a way to communicate. So assertion is a way to point something out. That pointing out involves a definite character. And that definite character as an assertion is fundamentally a form of communication, right? And to talk about assertion as communication is to ultimately talk about that which is articulated. Now you can see here, Heidegger is linking this back up with what we just discussed earlier in terms of that which gets articulated, right? Any assertion requires a foresight. Assertions are made in accordance with the significations that we have available to us, and therefore interpretation gets carried out primarily, not theoretically, right? And remember, this is an existential understanding of interpretation. It's not a theoretical form of interpretation. Now, ultimately, one of the things that Heidegger is what happened here? One of the things that Heidegger is ultimately interested in talking about in these sections is ultimately the idea of, he wants to, as it were, talk about articulation, signification, and he wants to talk about all of these things in terms of their relationship to logic, and logos in particular. And so he spends quite a bit of time in this section and in a couple other sections talking about this, because ultimately he's concerned with logic. And remember, in this course in Phenomenology, remember Edmund Husserl's original sort of touchstone for developing phenomenology had to do with his concern of what happens when we're doing logic and when we're doing mathematics. What's happening in consciousness. And you can see here, Heidegger wants to enter into that discussion here and talk about the idea of interpretation and logic and assertion and the relationship between subjects and predicates. Not only, he wants to add to it existentially by looking at the existential equiprimordiality of interpretation that will help us understand what an assertion is. The history of logic has ultimately fallen prey, from Heidegger's perspective, into an analysis of the assertion, but has never really looked at the necessary condition of interpretation as it's understood in this existential sense. Okay, let me get back into the text here, or into my presentation. Quote, when an assertion is given, I apologize for these spelling mistakes. When an assertion is given a definite character to something present at hand, it says something about it as a what, right? the as structure of interpretation has undergone a modification. That is, the as gets pushed back, right? Remember, we talked about the idea that you have this as structure. To see something as something else is dependent upon a certain way of interpreting, right? But when we talk about an assertion in this logical, formal sense, in an essential sense, then suddenly the as structure gets moved away from this sense of involvement that Heidegger has been talking about, and it gets modified into something that's present to hand. Now, this means that there's two types of as structure. There's two different ways of seeing something as something. On the one hand is the existential hermeneutic as. This is the as that he's been talking about. And the other type of as is the apophonetical as. This is the as of the present to hand. And like I mentioned before, Heidegger then talks about the history of logos and the way in which the as structure of logos, especially within the history and the development of logic, has ultimately sort of moved into just this, the apophonetical as, right? Not the existential hermeneutic as. Now, this ultimately means that we have to look at logic and assertion and think about the ways in which logic understands an assertion or a predication. Now, I don't want to go any further than this. I'm going to leave this to you, and you can take a look at Heidegger's discussion of this in a lot further detail. Okay, so in the next section, we're going to be taking a look at language, but we're already an hour on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to end our video at this point. And in the next video, I'll be taking a look, starting here with language, and we'll be looking at how Heidegger understands language within this dynamic of interpretation, understanding, states of mind, and as an existential hermeneutic. So I'm going to end the video here, and I'll see you guys in just a moment. Thanks again for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys online.